So let's go ahead and write the code that we need in order for our player to fire his weapons. So just like what we did before, I will be creating another player class. So just how we have the player camera, controller, and GUI, I want to create a player weapons class that encapsulates all the logic for handling the input and the calculation of the direction that a player should fire his weapons in. So jumping up here into code, I'm going to create a new class, and the class is going to be called player weapons. Now the player weapons class is going to have a constructor that's going to take in a couple parameters. First one is the player himself. The second one is the camera that the player is going to be following. The third one is going to be the player controller. The fourth one is going to be an IEnumerable of basic weapon mounts called basic weapons. Okay, this is going to require that we pull in a couple import statements. So let's go ahead and use our system collections generic, and let's add in our using Unity engine at the top.
Nice.
All right, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to store each one of these into a field. Now the reason we need 4 of these is we need the player, obviously, to get the player's current transform. We need the camera that is associated with the player, or the camera that's following the player, in order to determine what direction the user is trying to shoot in. We need the player controller in order to retrieve the mouse coordinates, because the player controller owns that information. And we need an IEnumerable of basic weapon mounts so that we know the weapons that we will be firing when we want to fire.
Alrighty.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stub out his update method, which we will fill in a moment, because now I'm going to jump back into the player, instantiate this class, hook him up into update, and then figure out how to get our basic weapon mounts out of the player game object. So jumping into player, I'm going to add another private field. It's going to be private player weapons. And then I'm going to say weapons equals new player weapons. Now, one of these arguments cannot be filled yet, but let's go ahead and fill the ones we can. I'm going to say pass in this, pass in camera, pass in controller, and then what do I pass in here? Well, what I need to do is I need to pass in a list or an IEnumerable of basic weapon mounts. So what we need to do is we need to retrieve all of the basic weapons mounts that are attached to this current game object. It's actually very easy to do. I'm going to store that information inside a private field of the player class himself, and then I'm going to set that to the proper list inside of the awake function. So let's go ahead and do IEnumerable, which is going to require me to bring in system collections generic of basic weapon mount. To retrieve this information, I can use a very handy method called getComponents in children of T. So I'm going to say getComponents in children of basic weapon mount. That is going to return an array of basic weapon mounts, which of course an array, because it does indeed implement IEnumerable, can be stored in a IEnumerable of basic weapon mounts field. So that I've stored it inside of a field, I'm going to fill in this blank right here, because I can now pass this information in. However, I'm not quite done with the player yet. I still need to tell the weapons component to update, and I also need to tell the mounts to equip themselves with the basic weapon that we set on the player. So to do that, I'm actually going to go ahead and write a method on the player, which is going to be public void equip basic, or I'll just say equip because the fact that it's a basic weapon is implied by the parameter that I'm going to pass in, which is going to be basic weapon. Now what's equip going to do? Well, equip, he's just going to simply say for each var mount in mounts, mount equip weapon. Now the final thing, or well, there's 2 more things I need to do, but the next thing I gotta do is I gotta actually invoke this method. Now the reason I separated that into a method that's public is so that it becomes very easy to equip different kinds of weapons to the player during the duration of the game. But for now, I will simply invoke the equip method inside of the awake method at the bottom, and I'll simply say equip basic weapon, which we've called basic weapon is that public field that we added to player that constitutes the default basic weapon. So that'll invoke this method. This method will loop through all the mounts and tell the mounts to equip.
Excellent.
Alrighty, so the next thing I gotta do, or the final thing I gotta do inside the player class, is I gotta go down to his update method and tell the weapons to update. Well, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have this be done at the end. The reason I'm having this done at the end is because the position will be affected by the controller's update, the position of the camera will be affected by the camera update, and both the position of the player and the position of the camera actually feed into the calculations of where the player is trying to shoot at. So that's why I update that here at the end.
Alrighty.
Alright, so now that I've done that, if we go back into my basic weapon mounts, we can start working our player weapons. We can start working on our update method here. Now our update method is actually going to be fairly straightforward. First thing it's going to do is it's going to say if not input get mouse button 0 return. So if the user is not holding down the left mouse button, just exit because you have nothing to do. If it is, then that means we need to fire our basic weapons or our mounts.
How do we do that?
Well, we first have to actually calculate a direction. Because see, if I loop over my basic weapon, so I can say for each var weapon weapon in basic weapons, remember these are my mounts. I can do weapon.fire, but I need to pass in a direction. So I'm just going to say direction, which isn't a variable I've made yet, but that is the thing we need to figure out. We need to figure out what is the direction that the player is intending to fire. Well, we can do that with some really basic pseudo raycasting, I guess you could say. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a ray based off of the cameras. So I'm going to say camera, screen point to ray. Then I'm going to pass in controller dot mouse position. Then I'm going to say direction equals ray.origin plus ray.direction multiplied by 100 minus player transform position. So what this does is we construct a ray out of the current mouse position based off the camera. Then we have the ray's origin, so that's where the ray started from inside of our scene, which is where our camera is, and we add 100 units in the direction, because the direction is a normalized vector, 100 units in the direction that the ray is pointing. And then we take all of this and subtract it by the player's transform position, which gives us the direction that we need to shoot at relative to where the camera is placed and where the player is placed. That being said, we still have to normalize the direction, so I'm going to simply say direction.normalize.
I'd say seems easy enough, but you know that's a lie with me.
Well, it's just straight. It works.
I'm sure to our programming students it is easy enough.
All right, so now that we've done that, we've finished our player weapons class, which again is responsible for handling input, and it's responsible for determining where the player is going to be firing his basic weapons. But we still have a couple more classes to implement. So let's go ahead and work our way down the method chain, starting at weapon.fire. Now weapon.fire is going to invoke our basic weapon mount fire method. What is that going to do? Well, what this needs to do is it needs to invoke the fire method on the basic weapon prefab's instantiation that was passed into the equip method. Now, if you recall, equip is actually invoked by the player class when we equip a basic weapon. Now remember, this basic weapon is a prefab, not an actual game object. So when we equip a basic weapon onto our mount, we need to instantiate that prefab. So to instantiate it, I need a field or a private field to store that instantiated reference in. So I'm going to say private basic weapon. Then I'm going to say weapon equals cast a basic weapon object dot, or I don't need to do that, I just need to say instantiate because I'm in a mono behavior. I'm going to say instantiate weapon prefab. And that's it. I'm going to do one more bit of code here. What we're going to do is if we try to equip a basic weapon that's when there's already a weapon equipped to our mount, I want to delete that game object. So I'm going to say if weapon does not equal null, destroy weapon.gameObject. Anyway, the reason why I wanted the basic weapon to be an actual object in our scene is because I wanted the basic weapon to have its own internal state, which you'll see will be very useful coming up here because the basic weapon needs to know what its fire rate limitations are. So,
alrighty.
Now that I've done that, I now have a reference to my weapon or instantiated weapon game object, which again is instantiated from the prefab passed into the equip method, which is invoked by player. So now when he goes to fire, I simply say weapon.fire, passing in transform.position and then direction. Transform.position being the position of our weapon mount, and direction being the direction that our player weapons class computed for where we want to fire. Okay, so let's go down a little bit further in the method chain. If I look at the fire method of my projectile weapon, you'll see it's blank, which, well, obviously is not what we want.
So what are we going to do about that?
Well, we're going to make it not blank.
Okay.
Sound good?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. The first thing that we need to do is we need to implement our cooldown. So I'm going to write a private float cooldown. And then in my fire method, I'm going to say if cooldown minus equals time dot delta time is greater than 0, return. So if we are still cooling down after firing successfully, then we need to exit the fire method and not actually do anything. Now, at the end of this method, I'm simply going to say cooldown equals fire rate. So the beginning of the method makes sure that we are cooling down properly, and the end of the method resets our cooldown counter so that we can only fire X amount of times per second.
Makes sense to me.
Alrighty, so the next thing we need to do is we need to say var projectile equals projectile instantiate prefab. Then I'm also going to pass in a position, and the position is going to be our position. And then the rotation is just going to be quaternion.identity, because we're going to calculate the rotation in the projectiles init method. So then I'm going to say projectile.init, passing in a reference to itself and the direction. So this allows us to tell the projectile about these parameters by passing in a reference to the projectile weapon object, as well as the direction the projectile is supposed to be fired in.
Okie dokie.
Okay, so the next thing we need to do is implement our projectile class. So jumping into projectile, we need to store a few bits of information. Now, the first bit of information we need are a couple floats. One of them, or actually, sorry, just one float, derp, which is our time to live. Which our time to live will be the amount of seconds that the projectile has until it automatically destroys itself. So, the next thing that we need to store is our private vector3 direction. We need to know what direction we're moving in. And then finally, I'm going to store a reference to projectile weapon so that we can retrieve the other information about our projectile weapon, such as the speed and the damage. So for a projectile weapon, we simply have to do weapon equals weapon. We're going to say time to live equals weapon dot time to live, and direction equals direction. Next up, we have to implement our update method, which is simply going to move our projectile in the direction that's specified by our direction vector. It's also going to check to see if it needs to destroy itself. So we're simply going to say if time to live minus equals time delta time is smaller than 0, destroy the game object that the projectile is attached to, and simply exit. Otherwise, transform.translate to our direction multiplied by our weapon's speed multiplied by our time.delta time in world space as opposed to local space.
Alrighty.
Okay, so we haven't taken a look at collision yet, but before we do, I want to go ahead and see how our projectile works. So if I hit play and click, you'll notice that we have projectiles.
Sweet.
However, there is one issue with them. I kind of forgot to rotate them. Whoops. So to rotate them in the init method of my projectile class, all I gotta do is say transform, look at, and then I'm going to say direction plus transform dot position. Now if I do that, jump back into Unity, we see that they are indeed rotated correctly. Like if I were to pause right now, we see that they are indeed rotated towards the direction that they're fired in.
Yeah, towards our local direction. Yeah, nice. We can now fire giant Tylenols at the Borg. Perfect.
Yeah, pretty much. And with that, I think it's time to move on to asteroids.